Hi, so thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Can I just ask you to really quickly just introduce yourself?
Of course, and thanks, Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be here today. So my name's Kim Yuracko, and I'm a professor of law at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law.
Thank you. Um, we've obviously spoken before now about the topic of this show. And, for me, in talking about this issue, I think that positionality is a really important part of the conversation. So, could you just start by giving us just a broad overview of yourself as a scholar? What your kind of your scholarly path has been, your focus, both kind of where you started and how that focus has evolved.
Yeah. So my training is as a political scientist, specifically a political theorist, as well as a lawyer. And really, for throughout my career, for about 25 years now, I've been focused on the question of what it means to treat people fairly and equally. What does non-discrimination mean in different contexts? And I'm particularly interested in what it means to treat people equally who are different in important and relevant respects. And that question becomes particularly relevant in sex segregated contexts. It's particularly complicated to think about what it means to treat individuals and groups equally when we're talking about sex segregated contexts like sports.
Great. So, you are already kind of leading up to this, I think. But when we talked about this topic initially, you mentioned that even though this is a topic that you've written about, the topic of inclusion of transgender athletes, you don't see yourself as being sort of personally invested in the outcome of the debate. So I'm curious, like, how you came to this issue in your scholarship. Was it just a logical extension of the conversation about gender and inclusion and equity? And, just why you think this is an important conversation to be having.
Yeah, actually, interestingly, the very first sort of paper I wrote as a law professor was about sports, and it was dealing with the question of um, what non-discrimination on the basis of sex means in the context of sports. And again, I was really interested in this question, which I faced it in different contexts throughout my career, of what non-discrimination means and what it looks like when individuals are different in relevant respects. And then in the sports context, what it means to not discriminate when we have sex segregated contexts or sex segregated categories. And at the time when I was writing that initial paper, um, the, there was really no push to move away from sex segregated teams. And the question there was, what does it mean to treat women and men sort of equally across these different categories? Because normally the sort of the standard paradigm for non-discrimination is that we measure people against the same metric, and that's how we know if we're not discriminating, is if we measure everyone against the same metric. And in sports, again, at that time there really wasn't a push to get rid of sex segregation, so people wanted to have sort of two different categories, and then the question was, how do we know if we're not discriminating? Then throughout my career, I've sort of been thinking about sort of again non-discrimination in a range of different contexts. But in the last few years, um, I decided to come back to the question of non-discrimination in sports to think about the question of transgender girls' inclusion and what it means to not discriminate on the basis of sex when we're talking about a category of individuals who don't a group of individuals who don't fit easily or clearly into the existing categories, so whose gender identity and biology may be distinct, and sort of how we think about what what non-discriminatory assignment and what equality and what fairness to all the individuals involved, what that sort of requires in that context. And then you asked about sort of why it's important. Um, the issues as I've delved into it, and you sort of started by the question by saying that I didn't initially come to this question feeling like I had a real sort of stake in the outcome. That is, I wasn't sort of personally uh, sort of either leaning towards or convinced of or kind of committed to any particular outcome. As I delved into the topic, though, and began thinking about it from a kind of a scholarly lens, I realized just how heated the debate is. And it's not surprising because why is this important? Um, there's a lot at stake for individuals, certainly opportunities, rewards, recognition, both for individual athletes, but um, really importantly, also for whole groups. I mean, sort of for groups of individuals who are identified with those who participate, and even more so with those who win. So there's a lot at stake for individuals and for groups in terms of the outcomes. I think what's also really important about this issue is that it should push us into a social discussion about sports and about what matters with sports. Because I think it's very difficult to have a conversation about how resources should be allocated without identifying what the resources or benefits are and why they matter to us. And that was a part of the conversation that I wasn't really seeing happening, at least not explicitly. It was sometimes sort of under the surface. But I think that's a really important that's a part of why this is such an important discussion to be having. It really has to push us to be thinking about why we as a society care about sports, particularly at the school level, and what we want the benefits to be, and that's got to, I think, guide us then in thinking about what the fair and just allocation of those benefits and resources are.
Yeah, so that is a point that is definitely explored in one of your recent articles. So I think maybe we should just go ahead and talk about that piece now. So this is your more recent 2023 article, which delves into the concept of benefit, and how the complexity of when we think about sports as a benefit. And you break that down into categories of basic, special, and group benefits. So I would love for you to talk about those a little bit more and how they relate to inclusion.
Thanks. Yeah. So I felt as I was kind of listening to you and reading some of the arguments, both for inclusion and against inclusion, that sometimes what was driving the the arguments and people coming from different positions is that people were thinking about sports in different ways and wanting sports to do different things. And so one of the things that I try to do in my work is try to categorize the range of benefits that I see sports kind of delivering. I mean, sort of the reasons why we as a society can really care about sports. And I reduce them to sort of three categories. And so the first category of benefits that I identify and focus on, I call basic benefits. And it's not my term, it's a term that's been used by others as well. And basic benefits refers to the sort of the physical, kind of emotional, psychological benefits that participants get just from playing. So everyone who plays, regardless of whether they win or don't win, sort of the outcome doesn't really matter. But one gets sort of physical health benefits from sort of running around, learning sort of skills, coordination, and one also at least a lot of the evidence suggests that people get sort of emotional and psychological and sometimes sort of cognitive benefits that come from playing. So people may learn leadership skills, they may learn teamwork. There's also connections to sort of mental health benefits. So there's sort of a range of kind of physical, psychological, emotional benefits that come just from participating. So the idea is there's a good that comes from playing sports. So these are benefits to participants. Everyone gets them just from playing. You might not get them to different degrees, but sort of everyone gets these benefits from playing. So those are the basic benefits. But there's another level of benefits that's also really important to this discussion of girls' sports and transgender inclusion. And those are the benefits that really go to winners. And so those are benefits like prizes, recognition, but also things like um, preferred acceptance to colleges. And that is sort of colleges often give preferential admissions to student athletes, also scholarship money. So there's both these kind of recognition type benefits, but also some of those benefits are real tangible that go to a subset of participants, and those are the winners. Um, and then, though, there's a third type of benefit that I, I actually think is perhaps even the most important one, and um, it's the one that I think is sort of underlying a lot of conversations and debates on this topic, but is I think often the least articulated, least explicitly named, and that is that um, sports conveys benefits to groups, and it conveys benefits even to sort of non-participants who see their group, a group with which they socially identify, being recognized and rewarded. And this was very sort of clearly a benefit that was identified and anticipated and trying to be fostered through the passage of Title IX. That is sort of part of what Title IX was meant to do. Is it was meant to get girls playing sports, but it was meant to sort of encourage younger girls to play sports by seeing um, older girls and women recognized for their athletic performance. And then even taking it one step further, um, there is this sort of goal of sort of changing the way girls and women's sort of bodies are seen and kind of socially viewed and understood and recognized. And so creating a kind of a social image and perhaps social identity for women's bodies that is strong and autonomous and physical in a way that is not hypersexualized. And so there's a I think a real benefit from sports that comes through seeing the winners recognized and rewarded, that goes not just to the winners but goes to the group that identifies
Yeah,
with
I
those
mean, I
winners.
think colloquially we think about that when we say things like representation matters, right? That that
Hmm.
there is a benefit to members of a group, right, when they see those they identify with succeed. Absolutely. So in your piece, you do go into an analysis of, based on which benefits you're kind of talking about, um, the conversation about inclusion of transgender athletes, you know, it shifts a little bit because if you're prioritizing basic benefits, there doesn't seem to be any clear or persuasive argument against exclusion of transgender athletes.
Right. It's certainly a lot weaker, and I think that's right, and that's why it's important to be thinking about what we care about. Because if all we cared about with sports was maximizing basic benefits, sort of making sure that everyone has access. So one thing, I'll sort of back up a little bit. When I identify the benefits, then I think it's important to think about, as a society, how we want to distribute those benefits and who has an entitlement to them. And the basic benefits to me are basically sort of health and wellness, which I think there's probably widespread agreement that everybody has an entitlement to. Um, and so then our goal would just be sort of getting the maximum sort of access to the basic benefits. And since we don't care, if all we care about basic benefits is we don't care who wins and who loses, there's really probably there would be almost no argument for exclusion. I mean, and there would be very little social debate, I think, really, if that was all we cared about. Um, we would just care about getting people access. So I think that doesn't get us very far in answering the current debate, but it's useful because it kind of at least kind of helps us identify, okay, what's driving the current debate is really not a concern about the basic benefits, but there are places and there are times where I think the concern about the basic benefits is the dominant concern, and that's useful to identify. So when we're talking about sports for sort of, let's say, kids under 10, maybe even kids under 8. I mean, I'll think back to sort of my daughter playing soccer at 5 and 6. Right, the concern there was entirely about the basic benefits of sports. We didn't keep score. No, nobody. I mean, the kids didn't know whether they won or lost. I mean, so the concern was entirely the basic benefits. And so this sort of separating out the benefits is useful. It's a useful exercise, um, not only just sort of as kind of like a theoretical thing, but there may be times and contexts in which the basic benefits really dominate, and when they dominate, that then should help drive our thinking about how we want to allocate resources. So when kids are really young, probably our concern about the basic benefits really dominates why we care about sports and how we should allocate opportunities. And in those contexts, then again, there's very little argument for exclusion, transgender girls exclusion for girls sports. But again, the reason we are having such heated debates about sports is because a lot of people care deeply about the special benefits of sports. They care deeply about who wins because there's so much at stake, particularly once athletes move to the high school level and to the college level. And and then we have to sort of think about, well, what's the appropriate way to distribute these scarce benefits? And when we get to the sort of what are the special benefits, when we get to the special benefits, um, they really can only continue to mean what they mean if they are distributed based on um, some version of merit that's tied to ability and performance. That is, if we were to distribute the special benefits by lottery, which might be a useful way to distribute the basic benefits if we have scarce resources, the special benefits will no longer mean what they mean. So the special benefits really have to be distributed based on merit. But the question then becomes, who competes against whom to decide who's the most meritorious? That is, the question when we come to the special benefits, we know they have to be distributed based on merit, but the question becomes, what's the appropriate grouping? What are the appropriate eligibility categories to decide uh, who wins? And and that's really the core of this particular fight. The core of the particular fight going on right now is eligibility rules, and how do we draw the eligibility boundaries for the female category. And that's where we've had a lot of sort of discussion, a kind of argument and rhetoric around sort of fairness, sort of what are the where are the fair places to draw the lines. And I don't think that discussion thus far has been super useful. I don't think it's been really fruitful. Um, so I think when we say we have to focus on eligibility categories, what's the appropriate eligibility category to then determine merit? It's important then to think about, well, what is this female category meant to be doing? So we're trying to figure out how to draw eligibility lines. There's been all this sort of rhetoric about what's fair and what's not fair, but we only can figure out what's fair, what's not fair, if we kind of know what that category is meant to do. I do think it makes sense to think about the female category as an ability proxy category. That is, I do think that the reason why we separate out the female category from a unisex category is it is meant to be a proxy for a level of ability that is different from the men's category, and really in most cases, um, inferior to. I mean, sort of a group that is going to lose to at least the elite in the men's category. So if we think about it as an ability category, that gets us a little bit, gets us to help a little bit. But then we're still faced with a really hard question of, is there any sort of real kind of plausible, convincing way to say that eligibility lines need need to be drawn sort of here instead of here, like sort of in one place versus another, and is one more fair than another? And I think this is where a lot of the sort of the debate has kind of gotten bogged down. That is, those arguing for inclusion, I think, say sort of rightly, there are a lot of outliers among biological women. And so why is it that the the eligibility line for this ability category of female should be drawn in such a place that will exclude transgender girls when outlier sort of cisgender girls are included? On the other side, those arguing for exclusion say, look, this is an ability category, and we have to draw lines somewhere, and we're gonna draw lines in places that sort of match, let's say, the overwhelming majority, particularly when you get to testosterone, you have a non-overlapping categories of testosterone for biological females and biological males. We're going to draw the lines, the ability category lines, um, at a particular testosterone level that is non-overlapping for biological women and biological men. I think it's extremely difficult to make a convincing argument that eligibility lines should be drawn or need, based on concerns of fairness, to be drawn in any particular place by looking only at what seems fair to to existing athletes or to participants. That is, I don't think any existing participants, any individuals, have any kind of fairness claim to have eligibility lines drawn in any particular way. I think it is um, as fair or unfair to say that a 5 foot tall woman has to play basketball against a 6'5" tall woman, as it is to say that a 5 foot tall woman has to play basketball against a 6 foot tall transgender woman. I don't think that individual athletes have any entitlement to have lines drawn in any particular place. And they certainly have no entitlement to have lines drawn in a way that's going to make their likelihood of winning better. Now, they do, I think, have some entitlement to have lines not shifted really quickly and to have sort of expectations, if they have been practicing under particular expectations, not to have lines sort of shifted without notice. Um, but I don't think they have there's kind of a strong fairness claim that lines have to be drawn in a particular place based on any claims of individuals. But I do think, though, there is this third level of concern, which is not just the sort of the benefits the individuals get, but this benefit, the group benefits that I was talking about previously. And I think to the extent that we as a society are concerned about maximizing group benefits, not only for sort of men, let's say both cisgender and transgender men, for cisgender women, and also for transgender women and girls. So, to the extent that we're concerned about group benefits, I do think a concern about group benefits can help guide us in thinking about the fairest way to draw the eligibility lines so as to maximize group benefits. So, again, just to sort of restate, I think it's really hard to to make an argument that eligibility lines for female sports should be drawn in a particular place based only on a focus on sort of individual rights and individual participants. But I do think a focus on group benefits can help us think about where eligibility lines should be drawn so as to maximize the group benefits that that both trans and cisgender, so girls, women, and men get from the way sports are divided.
Well, so that is complicated though, right? Because as you highlight, and I think this is echoed by people across the board, however we categorize sports, cisgender men are likely to emerge as the winners. And your quote is that cisgender and transgender women are left fighting for the scraps. And I think that that's really important, right? Because even when we talk about concerns over fairness in accessing special benefits in athletics, part of why that is so contentious is because the availability of those special benefits for the in the non-male category is so much smaller. Maybe it's larger than it used to be, but in so many ways, and we see it all the time, it is still not equivalent. So how does that, you know, play into this debate, or how does that affect the debate when we're talking about fairness and about equity um, between cisgender women or cisgender girls and transgender girls, when neither group's ability to access
Right.
some of those special benefits is equivalent to that of men?
Yeah, I think it's such an unfortunate part of this sort of debate and disagreement and the fighting that's happening on this particular issue. I mean, when I started writing about sports 25 years ago, the the fight was really about it was really between sort of women and men, and it was about the sort of the women's category and women and girls sort of seeming to be taking resources away from men's sports. And so, the requirement there, as Title IX was being interpreted, was that athletic opportunities had to be allocated based on in proportion to women and men, girls and boys, sort of numbers in the undergraduate population, or lower school, K through 12 as well. Um, and so the fight there was really to increase the share of resources to girls and women's sports. And what made it contentious was this idea that something was going to be taken away from boys and men. That it didn't have to be what happened, but when we have a limited pool, it turns out often to be, resources are going to get shifted. What is so unfortunate about the fight that's happening now is, as you say, you've got a pool of resources that remains not as significant as the pool of resources that's devoted to men's sports. We haven't actually realized the not only the promise but actually the legal mandate of Title IX as it is meant to be enforced. So there are not as many resources, that is, scholarships, financial support for women's athletics as there are for men's athletics. And now we have a sort of kind of an infighting over that smaller pool of resources. And so it's unfortunate because I think, right, we're taking groups that should otherwise be allies, and fighting each other, and we're fighting to divide a smaller pool of resources. And so that was why I do think these questions about inclusion or exclusion of transgender girls, they're really interesting and they're really hard. But I did want to sort of at least kind of bring people back to a recognition of this fact that is really unfortunate in this debate, which is men's sports is being completely unscathed by this debate. I mean, and so there is nothing about this debate that is going to sort of challenge or potentially diminish, or even sort of help push to equalize resources between men's and women's sports. It's like men's sports is just, they get to kind of keep going off and doing their own thing, and they are completely untouched by this debate. And so I just kind of at least wanted to kind of bring us back full circle, because there's been such heated debate on this topic and it is super important. But it's also kind of really a shame that this debate does not include a renewed kind of focus and analysis on the inequality between men's and women's sports overall.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in your 2022 article, The Culture War Over Girls' Sports, you highlight the lack of specific guidance during the Obama and the Trump administrations on how schools and leagues should assign transgender athletes to sex segregated teams under the Title IX regulations. And now Biden's Department of Education has proposed substantive amendments to those rules, which are anticipated, the final rules are anticipated now in November. So if the final rules end up being as proposed, schools would have, while they could not create like a blanket ban on transgender athlete participation, they retain the flexibility to develop eligibility criteria for sex segregated teams based on, criteria like the objectives of the sport, such as, and these are specifically enumerated, fairness in competition or preventing sports related injuries. So, kind of based on our conversation, it seems to me that fairness as a basis for exclusion could potentially create some ambiguity and confusion in attempting to implement policies or enforce policies under what may be this new rule. What are kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. And the way that the fairness concern is sort of articulated right now in the proposed guidelines sort of, I think, leads people to think about fairness to individual athletes rather than sort of fairness to groups. Um, And as I was saying previously, I think it's basically impossible to um, to distinguish between sort of different eligibility rules in terms of fairness to individuals. That is, I think there are innumerable possible eligibility rules that are all basically equally fair and unfair to the different participants. And it's really hard, I think impossible, to claim that any individual participant or groups of participants or sort of individual participants is entitled to one over the other. Now, if your view of fairness, if or not yours, if the sort of Biden administration view of fairness was focused not just on individuals but on sort of groups, then I think you might be able to sort of pull back and make arguments that in particular contexts, one eligibility rule was going to sort of equalize benefits for groups more than another. But that's not quite the way it's written right now in the proposed regulation. Also, from my own kind of vantage point, I think it would be helpful if the proposed regs kind of push schools when they're sort of justifying how they draw their eligibility rules to also sort of highlight um, which kind of benefit they care most about. Because um, again, sort of fairness, if we're talking about a world where we should care, or a context where we should care most about basic benefits, fairness there, I think we would have wider spread agreement on what fairness looks like for the distribution of health benefits. That is, I think we would be able to get widespread sort of social agreement that when we talk about health benefits, basically everybody should have equal access, and we should just do kind of a lottery, admissions. And if you still want to do sex segregation, pretty much everyone should just kind of get an option. And so I would sort of, I would think would be a benefit if schools were sort of pushed to talk about which kind of advantage, which kind of benefit they're focusing on most. But I absolutely agree with you that when we talk about fairness to individuals, it gives us very little traction to either say that an eligibility rule is fair or unfair.
Absolutely. And, I guess, and we haven't talked about this previously, but, I guess what I am wrestling with is whether schools really should be that concerned with special benefits accruing to any individual or group of individuals, right? That, like, you know, education, especially especially when we collectively fund education, um, our focus is on the collective, right? On the whole, and on the social benefits that come from us having an educated populace, right? That we all benefit from that, which makes it very difficult then when so much of the conversation about inclusion or exclusion seems to me, again, to come back to what any one individual has lost or how they have been harmed, which is something that you talk about in both pieces, just kind of the complexity of the concepts like harm and benefit. And I think that that's really the key to why we are struggling as a society so much with this issue. And one of the things that you raise is that, talking about the pain or harm that's caused by a particular group's inclusion or exclusion, the reason that's problematic from a legal standpoint is because of the subjectivity, right? That it is subjective both in intensity and also whose pain is important, right? Because prioritizing one group's suffering over another's, right, it is going to depend on the person making that determination. So, you know, could you talk just a little bit more about that and specifically kind of the risk that you mentioned of categorizing an individual who claims to have experienced pain due to the inclusion of others, kind of the problem of categorizing that individual's pain as rooted in bias?
Yeah, so there's a lot wrapped up in what you in your question and your comments, Sarah. So um, one of the things I was struck by when I first came to this topic and really began to sort of read broadly and listen to arguments was how much of the discussion focused on pain. And it's not that I don't care about pain. I mean, people's pain is really is important and it matters. But but as a lawyer and as a legal scholar, it struck me as strange because we don't, as a general matter, assign rights in response to pain. So we assign rights um, to protect against particular kinds of wrongs that we identify as sort of social harms in some way, but they're not. They're almost never sort of the where the right is created because of a subjective harm. The religious context is kind of closest to doing so, but as a general matter, we find rights because someone has behaved in a particular way that as a society we want to discourage. And so I found that the focus on pain um, is sort of surprising, and I wanted to sort of delve into and at least sort of think about, you know, it's not. It, there is a reason why pain doesn't form a good basis for legal rights, and some of the reasons for that are what you were alluding to, which is um, pain measures are highly subjective. They are highly both variable and also suggestive. So they change over time. They change depending upon context. If one is told that something is a bad, right? So after sexual harassment was created as a legal wrong, women experienced sexual harassment as more painful. That's not to say that sexual harassment beforehand was not a bad thing that shouldn't have been outlawed. And it was good that it was outlawed, even though it created more pain. But so the fact that there was an increase in pain doesn't mean we should get rid of the bad. We should get rid of the cause of action. So, but that the creation of the legal right should be, and really I think needs to be, for reasons that are independent of subjective measures of pain. And then you were getting at too, if we created rights only based on pain, not only do we have these measurement problems, but then are we just being purely utilitarian? And often we don't want to be purely utilitarian in the way that we create rights. And this is probably one of those contexts where we don't want to be, because um, if we are thinking about creating rights to inclusion because of transgender girls, exclusion creates tremendous pain for that group. If we really care about pain, then we either have to count the pain that comes from to cisgender girls from inclusion, and not just to cisgender girls, to all other people who experience pain from seeing their inclusion, let's say, or we have to justify um, not giving any weight to that pain. And sometimes we do. So when we have preferences for bias, for example, in anti discrimination law, we say we just don't give any weight to that preference. And so sometimes in the arguments for inclusion, you see people saying, well, the cisgender girls' pain, it's all based on sort of bias and transphobia, and we just don't give it any weight. I think that's too quick in this context. I mean, I think it's sort of difficult in most contexts if you really are making an argument that pain matters to figure out which kind of pain you don't care about. But in this context in particular, I think it's too quick to say that cisgender girls' pain is all about transphobia rather than their frustration at having eligibility lines drawn in a way that it was unpredictable to them or they thought was unpredictable and resulted in them doing worse than they thought that they were going to do. So I think there's been a lot of focus on pain. I just don't think it gets us much traction in figuring out what we as a society should actually do. And again, it's not because I don't care about people's pain. I do. I just don't think it helps us um, draw lines, and it's not useful in
Right.
helping
Well,
us draw lines.
and then in kind of discounting the expressed pain of cisgender girls who feel that they have lost opportunities due to trans inclusion, if you dismiss that pain, then you also kind of cut off the potential to talk about what we were talking about earlier, which is that some of that pain is rooted in the more generalized lack of opportunity for women and girls in sports, and I think that is a big part of the conversation that maybe
Yeah.
we could be in agreement about, but maybe is not getting enough like airplay in the current sort of state of the debate. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Well, I want to kind of close by asking you if you have any thoughts about sort of where this debate is headed. Maybe just realistically or ideally, what you would like to see sort of the conversation how you would like to see the conversation shift or grow or develop, and what you would like people to kind of keep in mind, as we have these conversations going forward.
Yeah. So I guess at the outset, again, I came to this topic from real kind of intellectual interest and curiosity because it really built on a lot of the other projects that I'd worked on before. I was surprised by how incredibly heated this conversation is, um, and how antagonistic the positions have been. So I think we would all be really well served if we could sort of bring the heat down on this conversation a bit because it's a really hard question. I mean, just intellectually, it's a really hard question, and and I think there's been a lot of just sort of rhetoric and name calling, and that is not enough sort of real engaged conversation. So so that would be sort of the first thing. I actually think the Biden administration, the proposed regs are a good first start. I think they're a good first step to kind of help that, what I hope will be a really kind of fruitful, engaged discussion. I thought they were, not perhaps sort of the perfect endpoint, but a really sort of thoughtful first point. It was clear to me in reading them that they had listened to different sides and had kind of were really kind of taking different positions into account. So so I would say what I hope going forward is kind of a lowering of heat and animosity, a kind of a more engaged um, discussion between people of different viewpoints. And then the other thing that I think is really important and is now happening on this issue. I mean, this may sound a little strange, but to disentangle sports from all of the other contexts in which transgender rights are at issue. I think this context is complicated enough, and when it gets bundled with trans rights generally, it raises the temperature, um, and just sort of expands the complexity, and it doesn't actually, I think, help us think through what we should do in this context. And so another thing I was trying to very deliberately do with my work here was say, I'm focusing on sports because how we think about non discrimination against transgender individuals in this context probably should be different from how we think about it in the context of prisons, or how we think about it in the context of bathrooms and locker rooms. And each one is complex enough, but for each one, I think we should think about what's at stake, why we care about what's at stake, and then sort of how we think what's at stake, the benefits, the goods, how they should be allocated. So um, so I think we're moving in all three of those directions of sort of bringing down the heat, kind of intellectual engagement, and sort of focusing on sports in particular, and kind of disentangling it from these other contexts which need their own, I think, really focused and
Right.
directed
And I guess
attention.
the question will be, to what degree we as a society can disentangle sports, from all of these other aspects of our social and cultural lives. Because I think, an observation, is that there is a lot of social meaning, wrapped up in sports participation and success in sports in our culture, that really has taken it kind of to a different place than maybe it occupied, particularly in like the youth sports space. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it has a lot more social meaning and value than it did maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so, whether or not we can do that as a society, I think will be another question that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot at stake with sports, which is why just focusing on sports is
Hmm.
complicated enough. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This was incredibly interesting. I really appreciate this. I will be sharing the links to your scholarship, in my show notes. So hopefully people will, delve more deeply into both your analysis, and, your observations, which you really just kind of gave such a nice overview of today. So I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank
It's a
you.
pleasure talking with you.